I'm going to now officially introduce our second panel session of today, and following on from the plethora of insights that the first panel shared on structuring considerations, we're now going to move a step further on into the journey of a new manager, and that is really getting very much robust and ready for that ODD inspection, really, from any prospective investor. The ODD IDD process is very detailed. It's getting even more detailed, and there are a lot of issues that new managers really do need to be aware of and prepare for. So very much looking forward to this panel. I'm going to start off by introducing our moderator today, Cassandra Powell. Cassandra is the Managing Director at Company Limited. So lovely to see you, Cass.
Hello, James. Hi, everyone.
Joining Cass, is Fiona Treble. Fiona is the Managing Director and Global Head of Membership at AIMA. So lovely to see you, Fiona.
Hello, James. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you fine.
Thank you.
Joining the panel is Jenny Kim de Smyter. Jenny is Managing Director of Sales Strategy at SS&C ES, and Jenny spoke on this panel last year. So again, delighted to have you on board, Jenny.
Hi, James.
And rounding off, we have Mark Landis. Mark is the founding partner and CEO of New York-based Wavelength Capital Management. And again, great to see you as well, Mark. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, James.
So, Cass, I'll hand over the reins to you. I'll be in the background if anything goes wrong. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Welcome, everyone, and to all of our panelists and to the listeners this morning for this panel. As we've been hearing from panel one and the initial presentation so far, the hedge fund industry continues to face increasing challenges from infrastructure, reporting and regulatory requirements, a tough capital raising climate, and continued fee compression. For smaller emerging managers, the question over the last 12 months plus has been, how do you raise capital without the ability to travel? How do you navigate the challenges of the ODD process in this virtual world? So in today's panel with my esteemed panelists, we hope to address a number of these challenges and hear from them in terms of their insights in dealing with emerging managers on a number of different fronts. So we'll start the panel with, I guess, an overarching question. With these ongoing pressures, how do you think the ODD conversation has evolved over the last 18 months? And how is this informing the way emerging managers should be thinking about their operational setup? Fiona, let's start with you.
Thank you, Cassandra. I think whenever you ask questions about ODD, and it's managers, we're looking at managers today. I think we need to look at things from the investor perspective. So what we need to understand is those investors that are performing ODD on next generation managers, they understand what next generation managers are, and they do understand that next generation managers aren't going to have the same operational complexities. They're not going to have the same resources as some of the larger managers, and you need to think about it from that point of view. That doesn't, however, mean that next generation managers shouldn't be thinking about how to get their message across, how to make it easy for the ODD manager to really get a grasp on their business and how they should be thinking. So just to give you a small example of how ODD managers adapt themselves, they'll understand that early stage managers, they won't be able to provide all the documents necessarily, such as system flows, but they'll take a common sense approach and they'll be looking for the manager to be able to demonstrate some very strong practices around certain fundamentals. And that will be things like, if possible, is there a segregation of duties, or is there a clearly defined process around valuation and protocols, and can these be explained? So I do believe that a common sense approach is still taken. It's been challenging over the last 18 months. I mean, in the first 3 months when we came into COVID, ODD slowed down, and then as everyone got more comfortable, they discovered Zoom. I'd never heard of Zoom before, I have to admit. Discovered virtual data rooms. ODD managers were very comfortable saying, yes, we'll sign NDAs, virtual data rooms, we're happy to use passwords, we're happy to provide comfort around what we're doing with this information, and usually there's a time limit to access as well. So managers were being given the opportunity to feel comfortable, smaller managers as well. But again, I don't think there was any excuses tolerated around, well, we can't show you this, we can't show you that. Operating diligence still expect that, and we shouldn't sacrifice in any way integrity just because something's happened, because there's a lot of operational and technical devices that have come into play now that everyone can make use of.
Sure. So certainly, Fiona, one of your key points there is that a manager should not sacrifice building a culture of compliance. And how you build that culture and how you demonstrate that are key things through this whole process. But you touched on a couple of other areas as well that I think we'll get into, things like that fundraising aspect. What do you show? How do you show? You know, and who do you use to be able to demonstrate that culture that you've put in place? And how do you utilize your operational budget to affect that? So are there areas that investors prioritize when doing ODD, and what sort of things absolutely do they not compromise on?
As I mentioned, segregation of duties, how cash is being handled, and valuation is very important at this time as well. I was speaking to an ODD manager last week. There will be some things, I mean, there are often managers say, look, we don't want to show you everything. These are things we'll normally show you on site. That's fine, redact some of the documents if it's a BCP policy, and those are definitely things that ODD people want to understand now. They also want to understand cybersecurity. How are you looking after and protecting your business when people are sitting at home doing lots of complicated work off, frankly, domestic Wi-Fi's? How are you looking after that information? You're not going to want, managers don't want to see, ODD managers don't want to see names and addresses of people or any confidential information, certainly not in Europe when we've got GDPR and then suddenly they're captured by all that and have to sign lots of forms. So if there's anything that's a manager's not comfortable with showing, that's fine. Explain why and just redact it from the documents, but you need to demonstrate that you have got these policies and procedures in place.
Sure. So certainly investors have become and are continuing to become more sophisticated. So for the smaller managers to be able to address those concerns, it's clear that they need to put into practice in terms of their DDQs and the use of service providers and best practice in terms of their internal services as well. So there are key things that you need to be looking at and be able to demonstrate as you've indicated. Jenny, what are you seeing in your areas for smaller managers to be able to demonstrate what investors are asking them?
Sure, Cassie. I think Fiona hit on a few points that are really important, that despite the changing environment and the challenges that COVID has presented to the overall ODD and IDD processes, investors are very sophisticated and they're still demanding a high level of a culture around compliance, having an institutionalized infrastructure in place. They want to make sure that their data is always protected. So cybersecurity goes into that, BCP policy, so everyone's working from home. What do you do when a Wi-Fi connection is interrupted or there's a power outage, like there has been in parts of the US over COVID as well? So what we do as a service provider is really look at ways to better service these emerging and smaller managers and provide them with the option to still put in these institutionalized infrastructures to make technology choices that help them check these boxes in the right ways without having to sacrifice their wallets in other areas, right? So when you're making decisions, I think Fiona mentioned this in our discussions before around prioritizing where you put your money and not compromising the processes that are essential to showing how decisions are made across the firm, making sure that there's full transparency where you can show it to the investors and the potential investors is incredibly important. And we, as a technology firm and as service providers, can help facilitate that. So what we've done is we've evolved our sales process and our engagement process with these emerging managers to allow for AUM-based pricing, for example. And that goes across, being part of SS&C, yes, ES has the technology, but we also have admin services. We have additional functions that we could package together for a startup, so that we don't have to have managers make very difficult decisions and sacrifice and compromise on things that are important, like BCP, and relying on your service providers to provide the cybersecurity, the data protection, the integrity of your entire process.
All right, Jenny. So it sounds like, with service providers such as yourselves, once a manager is understanding as to where they're looking to obtain their money and what the requirements are in that area for the investors, that you're providing them a runway to allow them to grow over time. Mark, as an investment manager here, what are your thoughts, or what was that thought process for you in terms of how you spend your operational budget in the early years for Wavelength, and looking at some of these areas that we're touching on now?
You have to think about it in a number of, we put all of our budget in Bitcoin. So at the end of the day, we didn't really have to worry about that. I'm kidding. When you think about the budget, realize that it's about planning. It's about thinking about and really doing due diligence on these providers. And I would, utilize someone like Jenny. Jenny and SS&C, they've seen, they've done, they've gone through. You can rely on these people about that. But as far as budget goes, you have to think about, we sort of planned and stuck to the plan. It's the same way that an investment manager, who's always the smartest person in the room, just ask him, talks about his strategy. It's the same thing on the infrastructure side. You have to think about what is going to be your budget for legal costs. Interesting. You obviously, from the last panel, you have to put together proper documents. You have to put a budget around compliance. What is compliance? Tax, audit, technology. Interesting thing about technology is that technology, to some degree, has gotten cheaper. You don't have to have 1,000 servers sitting in a server box going through that. There is the cloud. That being said, technology, cybersecurity, all aspects of the utilization of this is tantamount. Finally, marketing costs, which people sort of think about afterwards. Every investment manager wants to go ahead and get a lot of money in, bring a lot of money in. I got to bring a lot of money in. You got to think about it from the point of view that, what's the thing that's going to hurt you the most? The thing that's going to hurt you the most are the things you don't know about. We blew out our marketing costs. So I've made every mistake in the book across that. But to me, as far as thinking about the budget, you break it down into 6 or 7 areas. You have a budget. You stick to that budget. Obviously, there'll be wiggle room, but you go from there.
All right, Mark, that's interesting. And we'll just jump around and guess kind of focus on that right now. And how do you spend that operational budget? I mean, I think it's back to Fiona's early point in terms of understanding what your business is, where you're looking to get money from, and that sort of thing. So, Fiona, let's talk about in terms of that budget. Obviously with COVID, there is the conversation that you're not traveling. You can save money on what normally would have been your travel expenses. How do you factoring and listening to Mark's conversation about blowing out marketing, some of the costs that they in the early days? What would you say to the emerging managers now in this kind of environment, How do you kind of factor in what Mark is saying as they plan and they launch or they scale at this point when they consider costs?
That's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, so let's assume that you started your fund in 2019 and you did a budget for 2020 and 2020 happened. I'm assuming some of that travel budget, if indeed you were thinking of going to market, would have probably had to have gone towards things like getting your technology up together, making sure that you had robust systems. I'm sure a lot of managers already did, but really maybe getting an extra consultant in to see what was happening with your colleagues who are working from home. And now there's lots of obligations for employers to make sure that people have, they're not just sitting at a kitchen table with a chair that's not supporting their back, all that kind of thing. So I'm sure some of that budget would have been swerved into that direction. Personally, I think, we've all been saving money. That doesn't mean we have to spend it. So in the happy event that hopefully next year, maybe, I don't know, it changes every 2 minutes, certainly in the UK, when people can get back on the road, they're able to. Is it going to be more expensive to travel on airlines? Are you going to perhaps be traveling somewhere and having to spend longer there? Because maybe you'll have to isolate when you come back, or you find out that when you're traveling you have to isolate. So I don't think it's going to be any cheaper to travel. But I think that I ran this panel at Next Generation Manager Forum we did for AIMA at the beginning of the year, and it was about costs. And when next generation managers are starting up, I think it's much easier than it was 15 years ago, where you were expected to go to certain prime brokers, you're expected to go to certain law firms, your onshore and your offshore law firms, and they were the sort of same usual suspects. Now there are an awful lot of service providers that will focus, whether it's mini primes, smaller law firms that will focus on next generation managers. So you're not, as a client, competing with some of the larger guys. They've actually got people that are really going to look after next generation managers. There are also some things that, I mean, do you really need to have, this is an example I use, an all singing, all dancing CRM system when you've possibly only got 5 clients, friends and family in the beginning? Of course, you're building out your database. You absolutely need to keep notes, but until you're at a really larger level, I mean, paying a lot of money to maintain a CRM system and then get the help desk to support you, I'm sure that could be done in other creative ways. And when you get to a larger size, you can transpose all that information into the system. There are some things that I don't think that you have to spend a lot of money on. The jury's still out about locations and how much you have to spend on offices. There used to be, definitely in London, this sort of myth that had to be in Mayfair. That's where all the clients go. I think some institutional clients actually look at the offices and think, how much are these guys spending on offices versus what they could be spending on other things?
Sure, certainly.
So I think I think we're getting to an environment where, we can survive on less because we're not traveling. Okay. And I think there's a little bit more of a parsimonious approach to things. And yes, it's lovely to be able to have tier 1 everything, but you can't do that as a smaller manager. And you've got to really prioritize. Also, just one other thing, it will also depend on your strategy. I mean, if you're a high frequencies trader, you need to lose a lot of tech. You're going to be spending more money on that than if you've got a portfolio of 12 names, highly concentrated, and maybe you're more focused on research. So it will depend on your strategy.
All right, Jenny, and what are you seeing there in terms of a service provider and being able to
Sorry, Cassandra froze up for me.
Yes,
froze up for us.
I think I know where her question was going.
Go for it.
But to just add to what Fiona was saying earlier, I think there are a lot of options out there. Ultimately, you have to understand, you have to know your business and know where you want to put your budget. So there are a lot of options in terms of service providers and the usual suspects, as you mentioned, Fiona, but there's also decisions around what do you keep in-house versus co-sourced versus outsourced. how much bandwidth does each individual that's part of the fund have to give to run the fund efficiently. And I think it's important that as you make these decisions early on, you also take a long-term look at where you want the firm to go in terms of growth. So scalability and keeping an eye for where you think you're going to be in 12 months, in 24 months, and who are the prospective investors that you're looking to attract at those different time frames. That's incredibly important to keep in mind. So while you are making potentially some sacrifices in different areas, you still need to have an eye for growth and make sure that you are building processes that will allow you to scale up as you look to attract more sophisticated and larger investors. Unless you are like Mark and invested all of your money in Bitcoin and killed it, you are making very difficult money decisions, and you're having to, I think it's a really good point, Fiona, that you have to decide in each of these areas where you're willing to trim things down and where you're unwilling to compromise based on what your strategy is and what types of money you're trying to attract into the firm over time. I think it's incredibly important for emerging managers and startup managers to leverage the network that they create. So joining conferences like this one for Hedgeweek, or being part of AMA, being part of leveraging your service providers, even your former ones. Most of the people that I see in the startup space have done this before at sometimes much larger firms with much bigger budgets. So leveraging people in the industry, not just your peers, to source ideas, to understand challenges, and no one's holding some secret special sauce to close to their heart. I think a lot of peers and a lot of service providers and consultants are more than willing to help managers get started and to be successful. We all benefit from everyone's collective success. So leveraging a wide network is incredibly important.
Okay. So I think out of that, obviously, is to, the key is to plan prudently and for longevity, both in terms of your cost base and your service provider selection, right? I think from what I'm hearing from you guys as well is being able to effectively communicate that to your potential investors as well as to how you're spending your money and how you're thinking long term as to where your money goes. So when we talk about service providers, and utilizing your peer network and your peer groups and that sort of thing, when we've touched on it in terms of certain service providers out there, is there this concept of running with the herd? How does that impact emerging managers when you think about, everyone knows these law firms and these prime brokers and so forth? Does it bode well for managers to run with the herd in terms of selecting their service providers? Jenny, what do you think about that?
It's a loaded question. It's yes and no, right? I think it's good to follow, at least hear out what your peers have done or what the herd is doing. But to Mark's point about be willing to do your own due diligence process with these service providers and make decisions. I think you have to make smart decisions at every turn, because your wallet size is limited. When you have, the 6 areas, I think Mark, you mentioned like find 6 areas where you're going to budget to spend. You need to make sure that money is spent in the best way possible. So yes, definitely look into what the herd is doing, but also be willing to look at some alternatives. And you have to make the decision that's right for your firm. Sometimes it is going with the crowdsourced idea, and other times it may be that you find a niche product or a provider or a consultant out there that actually fulfills your needs better than what the larger firms might be doing.
Yeah. And so Mark, from your experience here, what were your thoughts on this in terms of, where did you spend your money? How did you select your service providers for the long term?
We just used ES and SS&C because
perfect.
they were and are always the best. I think it's exactly what Jenny said. At the end of the day, if you think about, and I always took the view from the investor's point of view, is, what are they thinking about? Everyone's gone through Madoff. Everyone's gone, well, not everyone, most of the people on the phone are on the video haven't seen what I've seen because I'm old. But at the end of the day, what have your service providers done for you? What have they gone through? How have they changed? To Jenny's point, there may be some niche strategies and niche products out there that can help you. And we found them. And we're technology-based quant fixed income funds. So it's all about technology and it's all about the utilization of technology. But at the end of the day, I take a look. It's the same thing. Think about who your investor is. Think about what they're thinking about. Think about what saves their job. Unfortunately, having a proper name in legal, in putting the documents together, maybe. In getting advice, yes. Going through, the auditing, going through the process of trading. Where can these guys lose their money? I was reading an old Skybridge, speaking of Bitcoin, an old Skybridge piece on due diligence. 50% of the reason why funds close, it's not because they didn't make money. 50% is an operational issue. And I always went into that in thinking about that. So these guys who are on the other side can lose their job. So if you're going to go outside the norm, there's got to be a reason to go outside that norm. But again, it's about your firm, it's about your culture. But there are certain areas where it's just easy to say, I use X, Y, and Z. But due diligence actually, when people used to come in for due diligence, you would sit there and go, oh my God, I hate this. They're awful people. They're trying to find something wrong. At the end of the day, if you do things correctly and you understand where they're coming from, you'll be fine.
Sure. So obviously it sounds then, Jenny, and Fiona and Mark, is that, the same way investors are doing due diligence on these managers, it's very important for managers to do this due diligence on their service providers. And whether that's your prime broker, your administrator, your fiduciaries, shameless plug right there, it's to understand what their value proposition is going to be for you in the different stages of your life. We've talked about that, in that early stage for these managers, it may be a certain name that they're getting up from legal and admin. And as they build that institutional wrapper around their business, to uptake, to get that next layer of capital as time goes on. But to understand your business and understand where do you start from now in terms of trying to build that out and being able to explain that to your investors. And obviously having your service providers, demonstrate to you what value they're going to add to you in this process. We talk about service providers, and we touched on earlier as well, various policies, procedures, and things that investors coming in may want to see. Is it, from a policy and procedure standpoint, and as part of that process, is there benefit to a manager to, in this case, run with the herd and put in place policies that a larger established manager may have even on day one? Fiona, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's benefit to having policies and procedures that work for your business, that truly represent your business, that when you say you're doing them, you are doing them and you can demonstrate. But going back to the question of running with the herd, I mean, there are lots of ways that alternative asset managements like to show themselves as being different. They produce great performance, they look after their investors. But there are some things when there is some benefit to running with the herd and there's no commercial benefit of being a first mover. And I think for smaller managers, that is in the realms of regulation and compliance. No one wants to draw any unnecessary attention to themselves with a regulator by doing something weird or wonderful or creative. You're going to be employing presumably external compliance consultants if you're not quite at the stage of having your own CCO. You're going to be employing lawyers. Ask those guys what they're seeing out there. The wonderful thing about service providers is when you're sitting in a manager, and I don't know whether Mark agrees with me, but when I was sitting in a manager, I knew my manager, I knew the service providers, and I knew my competitors.
Mhm.
The service providers have a really 360-degree umbrella view of the industry. They see everything. So listen to them and what they have to say. But I would argue that there's no benefit to drawing unnecessary attention to yourself around the compliance regulatory piece. Listen to the lawyers. Just a plug for AMA, your Global Trade Association. We have a lot of sound practice guides. We have a lot of peer groups and working groups. The whole benefits of those groups is people in similar functions, often competitors, are sitting around the table saying, guys, what are you seeing here? This is what we're seeing. They're not giving away any secret sauce or alpha or trade secrets, but it's in everybody's interest to make sure that there's not a massive blow up or people disappear from the market, because that doesn't help anyone. So there are great peer network groups that you can talk to like-minded people. We run a COO, CFO group, operational groups for those folks, marketing and IR groups at AMA. And as I say, competitors sitting around the room, but they're very happy to share some of that information with their peers to help each other. So yeah, you don't need to be, there's no commercial benefit to be as a next gen manager as being an outlier when it comes to compliance. Run with the herd.
Sure. All right. Thanks, Fiona. Obviously, we've been touching on over the last, 15 to 18 months and the impact of COVID here, and it's been very challenging on many fronts. We talked about this remote environment and virtual ODD and so forth. Jenny, what do you think, and what are you seeing as one of the other key areas where managers should not compromise in terms of policies, procedures, or that they've put in place to continue to build out this compliance culture?
I think we've mentioned it at the top of the panel. Some of the cybersecurity and data security issues that come up in the ODD process that managers have had to really focus on in COVID. It's one thing to check a box pre-COVID and say I have a BCP process. It's a whole other thing to see it in real life play out the way that it did for us in 2020. So I think there's a lot more focus around ensuring that the roles, I think, Fiona, you mentioned that it's really important that you separate out certain roles and you segregate responsibilities. How do you show that to a prospective investor or an existing investor that you have those policies still in place when everyone is working remotely, connected through the internet? Have you made the right technology decisions that allow you to seamlessly go from in office? Have you made decisions to go to the cloud early on to prepare yourselves to have this same access to the same types of security policies, compliance policies, and ensure that business continues as usual when everyone is working mostly remotely? And as we adjust back to being on-prem versus remote, I think most people are going to go into a hybrid model at some point later on this year, hopefully. It'll continue to prove out the importance of having very strict separation of responsibilities, making sure that your technology choices and your service providers support that, regardless of where someone is accessing your data. And in terms of the ODD process, Cassie, you mentioned that early in COVID, we found a lot of our clients had their investors defer ODD reviews till later in the year, assuming that this would only last a couple of months. But as we went through the summer of last year, we started seeing people really make adjustments, leveraging technology like Zoom, like Teams, to open back up these very necessary due diligence processes. And it's given managers an opportunity to show process and transparency in a new way, right? Without having to walk into an office, how do you show that your compliance functions and your front office functions are separated? And a lot of that comes down to the technology, service provider, and vendor choices that you've made early on.
No, thanks, Jenny. And Mark, how, to Jenny's points in terms of being able to demonstrate that compliance culture in this environment, how is Wavelength doing that?
I think exactly what Jenny said. We don't or didn't skimp on on our infrastructure in any way, shape, or form. We got and do a lot of due diligence on our third-party people, and we have people that we actually not only performed, but performed to a degree that we didn't even expect. So at the end of the day, your policies and procedures, it's a playbook. It's a playbook in case everyone has to put together a disaster recovery. Well, you can write out your disaster recovery, but in essence, we just had a giant disaster recovery type of event that occurred, and things were seamless because they were done correctly rather than putting together, because an ODD is about to happen, what they want to see. So again, policies and procedures, to me, exactly what Fiona talked about before. It's about how does your organization work and what are the steps that everyone has to take. Trading, valuation, books and records, client information, third-party providers, and compliance. You know, if you weren't on top of cybersecurity before, you were in trouble. Certainly when it went through this. So to me, again, it's about planning. It's about making sure the policies, procedures, code of ethics, you know, all of these documents that people talk about as you have to have. Okay, you have to have it, but do it. Unfortunately, do it. And it's going to say.
All right, certainly. So the idea is that when we go back to normal, managers can focus on attracting new business, as you've already, through this process, thought about the process and ensure that you've put in place your necessary policies, procedures through your discussions with your peers and the networking groups, utilizing things like the AMA best practice guide and so forth, that, you know, once things move back to more normalcy, you can focus on attracting capital. So in that process, in terms of attracting capital, you know, we've talked about considerations managers should think about making when spending their budget. Let's flip that now and talk about whether should managers be making concessions on management fees as part of this IDD examination with their investors. Fiona, what are your thoughts there?
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, I think that, as I said in the beginning, the kind of investors that will allocate to next generation managers understand that arena. As a next generation manager, you need your management fee in the beginning. You're meant to be putting together these policies. You're meant to be getting people to help you. You're meant to be taking on service providers. These people need to be paid. So I think we've done a lot of work on this at AMA, but there are imaginative ways to maybe you have the full management fee in the beginning, and then it switches to, as you get larger, the management fee decreases for investors, maybe the performance fee slightly increases. And that aligns you with your clients and aligns you with the growth of the business. I have sat at roundtables before when some investors have said, smaller investors, I hasten to add, say, you know, these guys shouldn't be paying charging management fees at all. They should be all, you know, upside on performance fee. That's just not practical. And also from another point of view, if you're trying to maybe grow your business, grow your employees, as an individual, would you be comfortable joining a firm that wasn't charging at that stage a management fee? I think you'd be thinking, how am I going to get paid down the line? And you'd certainly feel inclined to ask some very, I think, intrusive questions of the interviewers about, you know, well, how are you running your business? How is this business going to survive for the next 2 years? So I do think that in the beginning, the management fee is pretty vital for those smaller managers.
Sure. And Fiona, what are you seeing in your discussions? Sorry, Jenny, what are you seeing in your discussions?
Well, I was going to actually chime in there. I agree that we've seen some really creative ways that managers have structured their management and performance fees in order to raise assets. But I think it ultimately comes down to the transparency of where the costs are going. So if we link it back to it's critical to make the right decisions for your firm when you make decisions around what you outsource, what partners, your vendors, your technology sources, your service providers, your consultants, your lawyers, they're all supposed to be your partners, right? As you start, launch a startup and start building a track record. And so it's incredibly important with any investor, rather than being potentially too creative with your fee structures, where you start struggling to pay your own people and your own service providers, you have to find that balance between what you're willing to sacrifice and what you're not. And when you are charging a management fee, you have to be willing to be incredibly transparent on where those costs are going. So circling back to all these discussions around how do you make the right decisions, where do you not compromise, the reason why it's important to go through a similar due diligence process with your partners is because you need to bring that then back up to your investors and your prospective investors and show them that you're spending the money wisely and that it's a necessary part of running a secure, reliable fund. And that's just the cost of business. And so building a lot of transparency around justification of where your costs are going, and in that making the right decisions on the partners that you choose to work with, so that you get the highest value without compromising on quality.
Sure, great. And throughout this discussion, we've touched on a number of points, all of which I think lead as well to just demonstrating how challenging the role of the CCO and COO have become over time here. Mark, from your perspective, how, in terms of those roles and the challenges that are being faced, and all of the key things that we've talked about today for emerging managers and startups to be able to demonstrate, how does that in terms of that role, how does that individual be keep abreast of all of this, with your workers being remote and the challenges of raising capital and demonstrating a compliance culture?
I guess it goes back to what Jenny and Fiona were talking about. It's about your network. It really is. And I would say some of the least utilized people, every is your service provider. Jenny literally has forgotten what I know. She's talking to the biggest, the best. She's talking to some of the small people. She understands, a lot of the nuances that have gone in through this. Fiona on the same from another perspective. She's, as she said, she's got a network and is creating these networks. So for me, I've got and developed because a network of people that we constantly are talking to, and they become friends. And I think, Jenny made a very, very strong point. This world out here it's not, everything keeps secret, everything, I'm not going to tell you anything. This world, at the end of the day, there's no one has a secret sauce as to how to beat cybersecurity. No one has a secret sauce on what to do as far as, your valuation. You got to do it. And you got to do it right. So it's utilizing those people, how using Zoom, how is that, what do we do during our risk meetings? Are they secure? Are they not secure? As far as movement of cash, is it secure? And I'm doing it for my house versus somewhere else. Have you guys looked at anything else? So again, it's really simple, but it's not. It's just doing the work of utilizing people that are experts and or within those, and then drawing upon that. Unfortunately, there are too many people in the world and industry out there who think they're smarter than the next person, and they're not.
Sure. No, that certainly sounds like sage advice. We've covered a lot of topics today when we look at the operational challenges and evolution. I guess if I can give you an unfair question here, and Mark, we'll start with you. From your experience and so forth, what would be your advice in terms of what's your top priority when selecting your vendors here? in terms of when you look at investor demands and regulatory demands and your cost base and so forth? What would you say would be a top priority? Is that compliance? Is that cyber? Is that outsourcing? Is that your admin? How would you tackle that?
Unfortunately, I think there's no prioritization because, again, it's when we started our fund, I knew that the actual thought process and the actual investment philosophy would work. Where I didn't know was all of the stuff that we're dealing with now. What can get you? Where can that happen? Is cybersecurity more important than compliance? If you look at some of these statistics that I rattled off, if 50% of the of funds go away or close because of operation, I guess I was looking at some of the actual statistics themselves. 5% came from unauthorized trading, 7% from misappropriated funds, 7% from inadequate resources such as technology, 14% from other issues. So as far as prioritization, I think it's your infrastructure. And I know that's broad, but trying to sit there and say that accounting is more important than trading, which is more important than it's where can you lose money? Where can money go? And that's the way your investors are looking at it. And so again, I'm going to go back to you look at someone like your third-party providers, your Jenny knows. Jenny has seen it. Her company has seen it. We used Castle when I was at Tiger Management. So there's a lot of different iterations as far as that goes. So as far as prioritization goes, I wouldn't go there.
Yeah, Fiona, do you have the same view?
Yeah, I would agree with Mark. It's very difficult to prioritize, but I think practically speaking, depending on your COO, if you have a COO who's maybe, and a lot of COOs, if I'm correct in thinking, their backgrounds are either lawyers, accountants, you see a lot of PBs, former PB people going to COO. Maybe they bring with them some expertise. So, so they're more comfortable with the legal documents, but they perhaps need some help on other sides, like cybersecurity. So I'm sure that might direct how they hire and the priorities they put on it. I mean, Mark's absolutely right. In a perfect world, you should prioritize something, but I think practically it will depend on the characters and the personalities in a fund.
Sure, certainly. And Jenny, your thoughts on that?
I love the example of, do you pick cybersecurity over compliance? Because these days, I think cybersecurity is necessarily part of compliance. And when you look at ODD, so many, COOs these days are basically wearing 5 different hats, right? They're not just the operations officer, they're also the chief compliance officer. And as you blend all these roles together, you really do have to look at your overall institutional infrastructure and process. So it is a difficult thing to say prioritize one over another because it's all part of the same thing, right? If you're making certain decisions and perhaps spending less money in a very specific area because of the way that you need to run your business and where you generate most alpha, but the overall infrastructure itself does have to have an eye towards security, compliance, look at your outsourcing options and vendors, cloud adoption, and making sure that you have an actual functioning BCP process that not only works within your firm, but also includes all of your partners. All of your vendors need to be an active part of that BCP and the DR process. And I think you need to look at the overall structure of how you run your operations, making sure you check all the necessary boxes, and then go a layer down and decide, all right, where are the places where we can make some concession? Because it can't just be spend a lot of money on compliance and cybersecurity, but don't spend money on technology to help ensure that you're actually compliant and safeguarding all of the investors' data.
Okay. Great.
And doing that will make the ODD process a lot easier and probably a lot less painful.
Great, those great insights, guys. So, in 2 seconds or less, guys, I'll jump to each one of you as we conclude this panel. What would you offer as the single most important piece of advice to the audience in terms of how to approach ODD and present yourselves in the strongest light to investors? Mark?
Plan and follow that plan.
Fiona?
Make sure whatever you do, you understand what you're doing it, why you're doing it, what the investor's looking for, and please have some integrity in what you're doing. That's very important.
And Jenny?
I'm just going to second what Mark and Fiona said, and be willing to be transparent. Be open-minded about answering the right questions, be direct about your answers, and know your business really well.
Great, guys. Well, thank you guys so much for all of your insight today. We covered a lot of topics, and I'm sure any of our attendees today can reach out to you guys if they have any follow-up questions. But thank you so much for speaking today.